Good morning, everyone. You made it through the snow. Good to see you. I'm Dean Jackson. We've got Brian and Simon, Sodajerker here. I've become obsessed with their podcast over recent months. They've spoken to anybody who's anybody in the world of composition and writing music. So if you want to get any hints from them, then these are the guys to do it. They've heard it all, and I'm hoping that they've squirreled away some tips for us, and that maybe are able to give you the winning formula, whatever that might be later, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Thank you for being here, gentlemen.
Well, thank you for having us.
Can you just give us a bit of the history of Sodajerker? How did it all start?
Yeah, so me and Brian met at school when we were 12, and we were in the same class, weren't we? Mm-hmm. And I guess we got interested in music around the same time. I was already in a band. Brian learned the bass to join my band, which was a little beat combo called Blue Rinse, which I thought was pretty cool. And then we just kept doing it, didn't we? Kept writing songs together. We had a 4-track the size of a mini fridge.
That's right, yeah. And we were in a band together, wrote songs. Then that band eventually broke up, and that's sort of the emergence of Sodajerker.
Yeah, drummer moved to China, which made rehearsal difficult.
Yeah, and Sodajerker sort of started out as a songwriting duo partnership, and then somehow morphed into what it's become today.
That's right.
So who was your first guest?
Our first guest was an American songwriter called Billy Steinberg. If you don't know Billy Steinberg, he wrote Like a Virgin for Madonna, Eternal Flame for the Bangles, I Drove All Night, Roy Orbison.
Yeah.
What else?
Oh,
So many.
Alone by Heart. That was
so many
power
hits.
ballad.
He co-wrote them with another chap, and he was the perfect template for us, really. And we didn't even really know, because at the time we'd never done anything. We'd had no interviews or anything under our belt. So we literally just sent out some emails saying, do you want to be on our podcast, which had no episodes at the time. And luckily for us, he just replied and said, yeah, okay. I think it's great that you want to shine light on songwriters, because at the time there wasn't really much of that happening. This was sort of 2011. And he said yes, and he was great, wasn't he? Just told us amazing stories.
Yeah, I think if it had gone badly, it might have put us off, to be honest. But he was the perfect guest. Yeah, had great anecdotes, very friendly, accommodating, and so that sort of galvanised us really to do more.
And from there, the second episode was Todd Rundgren, who's a
Wow.
major American producer. So yeah, once we got that, I remember texting Brian and saying, he said yes. And it just went from there, really. It kind of snowballs, because once you pick up 2 people like that, then you can say, oh, well, you know, Todd Rundgren's just done the show. Would you like to do the show? And people say yes, then they're more likely to say yes, I guess.
I mean, they're pretty big names to start with, but, you know, sparing your blushes, give some of the A-listers as well that you've spoken to on this podcast.
We've been very fortunate to sit down with Paul McCartney, Paul Simon, Alicia Keys, Sting, Lindsey Buckingham, who else?
Jeff Lynne, Noel Gallagher, Tori Amos, Roseanne Cash.
Loads of people.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And do you think it's the reputation that's gone before those artists that encourages them to take part?
I think so. I think if you're consistent and deliberate about what you do and you keep going for a long time, it becomes kind of part of the establishment in terms of music press. And so we get lots of offers for these guests, and people just think, well, if you've got an artist that you need to promote who writes songs, then you should probably see if they want to do a Sodajerker episode. So it just becomes part of the system almost.
Having been through these hundreds of guests, do you see any common themes that emerge that make someone a good songwriter? Are the characteristics that they have either intellectual or emotional, or are they all just totally different?
I think one characteristic all great songwriters share is they turn up and do the work, put the work in. They don't necessarily subscribe to writer's block. They just sort of work through that, and I don't know, what are the common themes?
Well, I mean, turning up is probably one of the most important things, and that's what we found is, like, creativity is oftentimes, for professional people, is a scheduled thing. They don't, sit under a tree and wait for an apple to land on their heads or anything like that. It's like they say, right, we write all week from 9 to 5, and then they sort of find inspiration along the way. Because once you make that space and you're in the gym, if you like, then good things start to happen. So I think if you want to be a professional and you want to make things happen, you've got to be disciplined. You've got to set that routine. And almost everyone we talk to has some kind of discipline like that. Of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't lightning bolt moments that happen. You know, you will get those things where, you know, oh, there is nothing, and then 2 minutes later there is something there, and it just seems to fall from the sky, and that's what's so mysterious and magical about songwriting. But at the same time, they probably wouldn't have got that if they were just in line at Tesco. You know, they have to be sitting down in a space which is conducive to creativity. So a lot of people have that quality. Some, I mean, they're all different in a sense. Some of them have crazy kind of brain chemistry, don't they? And they're just interesting thinkers.
Yeah, no, that's true.
It is interesting because I know, speaking through BBC Introducing to very often young and new songwriters, there is a belief that you have to wait to be in the right frame of mind before you can do this. But actually what you're saying in some ways is the reverse of that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of our thesis, I guess, isn't it, with the podcast, is that waiting for inspiration is not that good an idea.
Yeah, you've just got to show up at the coal face, really, and you know, it doesn't mean that every idea you come up with is going to be a good idea. I mean, that's a common thing as well. A lot of people say, you know, you've got to write 9 terrible songs to get the one good one. So, you know, you've got to kind of finish everything, and at least, you know, with the bad songs, you're still practicing your craft, you're still honing it, you're learning all the time. You learn as much from the bad songs as you write as the good songs you write.
And one of the other things that happens in that process is that people accumulate a lot of material, and it might not be all usable material, but there will be bits and pieces in there. So a lot of the people we talk to, they document their ideas in some way. So they'll have voicemails or voice notes or whatever. They will have some kind of physical archive with scraps of paper and lyrics and things like that. And then as they're writing into the future, they'll say, oh, I really need a bridge. What about that thing from 10 years ago from that song? And it fits, it's in the right key, or it just feels like the perfect change for the song. So a lot of the songwriters are archiving their ideas and being quite diligent about cataloguing stuff, we've found. Yeah,
and obviously these days it's a lot easier to do that than it was maybe even 20 years ago. You know, everyone's got a voice memo app on their phone and a Dropbox to, like, you know, start like a folder of ideas and things like that. So
yeah.
Brilliant. We'll come back to those ideas a little bit later on, actually. But you mentioned writer's block there a moment ago, and I guess this all fits in with the idea of inspiration and not just waiting for the moment to arrive, that you are hacking away at it constantly. And there's a really great clip from, this is episode 201 with Moby here, who's talking about writer's block and how he copes with it. In fact, I'm not even sure he agrees it exists, does he? But we'll see what he has to say.
You know, because I write screenplays, articles, books, etc. Writer's block is a real thing because Microsoft Word does not do anything for you. You know, but music, as you can see, you know, Simon, like looking behind you, like if you have writer's block, pick up a guitar and play a chord. Turn on one of those keyboards and start scrolling through patches and see what happens. Like the instruments really do, as far as getting something going, they're doing almost all the work for us.
So he's talking there about the fact that if you're looking for a melody, I guess, really, here's a good way to go and find one.
yeah, and that's a common thing that comes up as well. The thing about an instrument, like just sort of, you know, playing a chord, finding a sound, that can, certain instruments can maybe prompt, you know, trying out something on an instrument you're not familiar with, can sometimes break you out of the patterns that you fall into on a guitar or a piano. And sometimes a sound can conjure a mood, and before you know it, you're off following that path, you know.
Yeah, I think, was it Noel Gallagher said that some guitars have songs in
Yeah.
them?
That's what he thinks, yeah.
So whenever he's stuck for an idea, he just gets another guitar out of storage, because obviously he's got loads of them, and each one might contain something that will inspire him to write something new.
That's interesting. So changing the instrument, but also not just changing the guitar for another guitar, but changing the instrument up completely, maybe to something out of your comfort zone. Is that what you're saying there?
Yeah, basically, you know, pick up a ukulele or anything you're not familiar with that you can, you know, get a tune out of is a good way to break out of sort of habits, well, not even bad habits, but just the same old chord sequences and things like that.
Yeah, the same goes for altered tunings as well. We find that with guitar players a lot of times. They'll just experiment with changing the tunings on their guitar, and maybe they're using kind of the same chord positions, but they get a completely different sound, and that sort of can elicit a new idea quite easily. When we interviewed David Crosby, he said that he had sort of 10 guitars hanging on walls around his room, and they were all in different tunings. So he would just sort of select one for the evening and see what it brought to.
And sometimes it can be as simple as just switching it. You know, if you mainly work on piano or guitar, it's just a matter of switching between the two. You know, what sounds a little bit pedestrian on an acoustic guitar, suddenly you play it on a piano and it sounds quite, you know, lush and romantic or something. So even that can just help you along with the process.
That deals with the melody. Also, some advice here. This is episode 204 we're about to play. This is Laura Mvula, who is talking about where the lyrics come from. And you were saying earlier, this is quite a common thing that artists do. I didn't know this. Have a listen to this. Laura Mvula.
Usually if words come, it's like I'm a one phrase person. So I probably will have like one line for like a week and that's it. And the rest is just vowel sounds and, you know, jibber jabber, because I prefer to stay in the feeling rather than obsess over crafting the words. I think lyrics have always been secondary to me.
So it sounds to me as though what she's saying there, I don't want to put words into your mouth because you'll be able to explain much better, but she's basically just making random noises to see what happens, yeah?
Yeah, that's what tends to happen. People will try and articulate a melody over a chord sequence, and instead of sort of labouring over every word, they will just sing gobbledygook essentially over the top. And once they formulate something that sounds like it might be a hook or sounds like it might be a word, then they'll start to actually translate those sounds into actual lyrics. So they might hit upon something that sounds like they're saying a particular phrase, and then they'll write that phrase down later on. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because some people start with the words. She said lyrics are secondary for her, you know, and so she's thinking, I need to get a nice vibe going, I need to get some music happening, I'll sing some sounds over the top and maybe I'll hit upon a hook. Whereas there are other people, of course, who will write prose first, or will write a page of lyrics first, or we'll start with a title or something like that. So essentially what we found throughout all these episodes is that there is no one way, there is no approach or formula, if you like.
And do you think some songwriters switch between the two, that they might start with prose for one song and then start with just jamming for another one?
I think so, yeah. I mean, there are some songwriters who are almost, you know, superstitious about how they write songs and will do it the same way every single time. But I think you find most would say they do it every which way. Sometimes a tune will come first, sometimes it's just a chord pattern, sometimes it's just a little piece of instrumental music they might have come up with that to try and put something over the top of, or that someone gives them that they try and sing over. We've had a few, Matt Berninger of the National. Basically how he writes is his band just make these rambling kind of instrumentals on GarageBand, send them to him, and he just freestyles over the top, and then he goes back over what he's freestyled and just, I like that bit, and then he builds the song from there.
What was that phrase that he had, which there was a phrase in there, and his wife, I think, thought that he was saying something particular, and he couldn't remember what it was. And he took that and then made that the title of the song. And little things like that, just finding those nuggets in there. It was
something she'd heard,
yeah.
That it sounded like this specific phrase to her. It wasn't what he was saying, it was just gibberish. But she heard a phrase in his gibberish, and a song sprung from that.
There are some songs where this gibberish sort of endures. I'm thinking about ELO, Don't Bring Me Down, where they sing Groose, don't they? And apparently he just sang the word Groose in the studio as he was recording, and then found there wasn't a word to replace it, so it doesn't mean anything, does it?
Yeah, it doesn't mean anything. Yeah.
I think most people think it's Bruce, but anyway. So let's move on with another clip here. So we heard Laura Mvula there talking about making random vowel sounds. This is from episode 206. This is Marina from Marina and the Diamonds, I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And this is her talking about, I think, really just going a bit over the top and seeing how that works out for you.
That's something that I feel really confident about, that I never run out of melodies. So yeah, it's something that comes naturally. I don't really have to do anything about it. It's just like with the chorus on Ancient Dreams, it's quite strange. It's like a strange leap up, and it's a bit like dissonant as well. But for me, that just feels so exciting to write, and I obviously hope that listeners get that same reaction as well at that point in the song. Recognize that I could be the eye of the storm. I am not my body,
So it feels like what she's saying there is just try and be a bit over the top, be exaggerated, yeah?
I would say so. I mean, my theory is with creativity is to be truly original, you have to risk being incredibly annoying. And if you think of people like Kate Bush, think of people like Bjork, or even Sparks, any band who do or artists do a little bit different, a little bit quirky, they do sort of walk that tightrope of being genius and just driving you up the wall to hear them. And I love all those people, but sometimes it's like, oh God, that's enough. But I think to truly sort of be original, you have to go over the top sometimes to find those truly original ideas.
We love anyone who'll, labour over trying to make a melody distinctive, and those strange leaps and intervals that you've got in that chorus there. We love anything like that.
Yeah, but then obviously the trick, or what you really aim for, is to find something original, but also singable, something that people can kind of latch on to. If you think of a song like, if you're talking about Kate Bush, like Babushka or something like that, it's a very inventive melody, but incredibly catchy at the same time.
And you want to try and marry any distinctive thing that you do with some kind of either a message or some kind of emotional content, some kind of statement that might connect with people, because it's all well and good having a great tune, but if there's nothing else for people to latch onto or connect with, then that is perhaps a bit limiting as well.
I mean, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because powerful songs affect you when they listen to them. They're going to bring out an emotion of some description, aren't they? Invariably, I would say, really. I'm just you mentioned Kate Bush, Babushka there. I'm just wondering, when she was writing that, do you think she kind of thought, well, what mood am I trying to create here? Or did she just do her thing and then leave it to everybody else to make their decision about what it was about or how it makes them feel?
I honestly couldn't say, because she's one person whose process is incredibly mysterious, really. She doesn't talk a lot about how she does things. She barely does any interviews, and that's...
Much to our chagrin.
Much to our chagrin, yeah, but that adds to the mystique of the artist as well, Some people don't want to reveal everything. Some people don't really want to analyse what they do, because they might destroy it if they do. They don't want to think too consciously about it, because it's working for them, and that's fine,
Yeah, McCartney's always sort of said that, hasn't he? That he doesn't like to sort of go too deep into the process in case he kind of disrupts the magic in some way.
When you're in a particular frame of mind, so if you're feeling down in the dumps, perhaps even a bit depressed, is it best to write a song that indicates that you are down in the dumps at that moment? Or is it best to try and do the opposite, would you say, and try and break out of it and make a song that's full of glee?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there's been plenty of great songs written when people have been depressed or needed to, vent or something like that. I remember Sting being asked years ago whether his one of his albums, which was sort of quite emotional, was because he was depressed at the time, and he said, not really. I've got 40 years of life behind me or something, so I've got plenty of things to call on if I want to write a sad song. We've all got our experiences, and there's plenty of things that we can kind of use as fuel for writing if we want to.
Yeah, I think personally speaking, I mean, we write songs as well, and I think the last thing I'd want to do if I was in a depressive state would be write a mournful ballad. I think that just might make things worse.
There are lots of songs that are written about missing home that have been written on tour, aren't there? You can see how that would happen, I guess, Yeah. And then there are songs like the new Freya Ridings one, Weekend, which is a joyful melody, and you listen to it and think, oh, this is a song about the weekend, great. And then you listen to the fact that she's been through these utterly miserable weekends, and you've got the lyrics, which are really at odds with what the melody is doing. I suppose the Smiths were good at this one as well.
Yes.
Is that a good technique to use?
Yeah, we find that quite often, actually, that people will marry either a fairly dark lyric with upbeat music or vice versa. And we really like that because, if you're feeling like this is maybe often happy music sounds a little bit throwaway in some way, and then if it's got a darker lyric and more substance to it, then that can give it a lot of gravitas or weight. We interviewed Andrew WK some years back. If you don't know him, he's known for his kind of party rock, and he dresses in all white and he's very intense. And he said that he had no real ideas about what to write lyrically for any of his songs. So what he would do is he would make music, and then he would get into a certain spirit, and then he would let the spirit of the music inform what the song should be about. So he was actually kind of translating the mood of the music into his words, which is why they're probably all about partying, I suppose.
Yeah. Andy Partridge of XTC had a similar approach, didn't he, with they had a hit song called Senses Working Overtime. I don't know if any of you know that one. But, I mean, he's one of these guys who has a sort of synesthesia almost, where he hears a certain chord voice and he goes, "Oh, that sounds like the soil to me. That sounds like earth. That's people digging." And he sort of just followed that route with this chord sequence. And then, so that's another way people do things. They just, you hear a chord sequence or a selection of notes creates a picture in their mind, and so they follow that.
And it might be something in everyday life. You might be walking past a pneumatic drill, or actually we've got Tori Amos here. This is episode 216. Here's she's talk. Well, I'm not going to tell you what she's talking about. Let's let Tori Amos do it. She'll do it much better.
I'm going to look at art books. I'm going to listen to music. I'm going to watch documentaries, watch some movies. I'm going to go observe. I'm going to go sit on a cliff and watch, see what happens. And then when you do that, then you start collecting. You start collecting observations, sounds, the rhythm of the gales, what's happening. And I start then building my sonic pantry.
This is not really happening. You bet your life it is. You bet your life it is. Honey, you bet your life.
Building a sonic pantry, that's an interesting phrase, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice way of describing getting a repertoire of stuff that's inspirational to you, I suppose. And when we said that people catalogue ideas, oftentimes they're going, "Oh, that's a cool phrase," or "I like that title," and they just keep all these things, and then when they're in a creative mode, they'll sit down and start playing, and if what they play marries up with that title, then they'll probably start singing that title over the top, and sooner or later they've got a chorus. So, yeah, it's about... I mean, it's very hard to sit down at a blank page, isn't it, and just kind of produce something great. But if you're gathering things as you go, then you've at least got something to start with. Mm-hmm. And people talk about song starts, you know, having like bits and pieces of things to work on when they sit down, and that can be really useful. Obviously, Tori Amos is someone who describes her creativity in a very kind of arty kind of way. She talks about the muses.
It's quite mystical.
Yeah. Muses inspiring her and coming to her in the night when she's at the piano and all this sort of stuff, which is fine, you know, that's one way to describe it. Other people that we've spoken to, like when we spoke to Miranda Cooper from Zenimania, which was a kind of a popular production house that did loads of songs with Girls Aloud and bands like that, they had a much more industrialised kind of approach, didn't they? So they weren't sort of stocking the sonic pantry, they were building tracks, taking the middle, putting it on another track, seeing if it worked as a chorus for that one. Then they'd all get together with a piece of blank paper and they would listen to the track and all write down ideas that they thought might work, and then they would test those ideas against the tracks, and it was like a much more of a kind of modular factory kind of approach to songwriting. So again, it happens all ways. You can do it in that very sort of spontaneous, creative kind of way, or you can do it in a much more practical way.
You mentioned it's being a factory there in some ways, and going back to the era of Stock Aitken Waterman, they had the hit factory, didn't they? Mm. Do you think it is possible to hit a winning formula that you can use over and over again for a while?
They did, didn't they?
Well, they certainly did, yeah. And if you go further back to Motown, you know, Holland Dozier Holland, I mean, they literally wrote a song called "It's the Same Old Song," which was an in-joke because they were basically just rehashing 3 or 4 previous songs that they'd had hits with. And if you listen to a lot of their hits from a particular era, you know, similar chord structures, similar melodic leaps and things like that. So there's definitely, I mean, yeah, that's the proofs in people like Motown and Stock Aitken and Waterman, yeah.
Stock Aitken and Waterman used to like take the bass line from a hit and reverse it and then put something else on top. You know, Rick Astley, give that one to Kylie, you know, that's how it worked.
But it did work, didn't it? For
Absolutely.
Years and years and years, they dominated the charts, yeah.
Yeah.
Why do you think that stopped? Do you think people just, in the end, see through it or get tired of it?
I think everything has its day, doesn't it?
That's it, exactly, yeah. You know, everyone has this sort of purple patch where everything seems to work, and, you know, yeah, but everything has to come to an end.
Yeah, the culture, I think, in the 80s for that was quite specific as well. You know, Thatcher's Britain and yuppies and, you know, that sort of pop music.
Yeah, and those records were very rooted in the technology of the time as well, and obviously technology's constantly moving, so records that sound current one week might sound passé the next. So
Yeah.
Tori Amos talks about sitting on a cliff. Well, we don't have any cliffs in Nottingham, unfortunately, but is there a way that you can trigger the creativity, do you think? Or is it best to stay at home and do something to your room to create to bring about the right atmosphere, or should you be going somewhere else, the equivalent of a cliff top, do you think?
We hear both versions of that, don't we? So we've had loads of people talk about walking as a kind of a catalyst to creativity. So they will go for a walk in the park, or they will, you know, write when they're traveling on tour, on buses, on trains, and that sort of thing, because the movement for some reason helps.
and the monotony of the journey as well sometimes can just send your brain off elsewhere.
But at the same time, we've had lots of people talk about their superstitions and the way they like the spaces to be configured when they're going to write songs. So some people are quite superstitious. They'll say, I can only use this guitar. I have to be in my studio and it has to be painted white. I want the room to be a blank canvas. I need everything at arm's reach so that nothing is hard for me to get. 'Cause if it takes me 5 minutes to plug a keyboard in, I'm going to lose the idea. You know, or, you know, was it Neil Finn said I have to have a shave?
Yeah.
And then I have to prepare myself for the writing day, you know. So
Ritualistic.
yeah, it happens always.
And other people have told us that there's a songwriter called Colin Hay, who's in the band called Men at Work and is a great solo artist, and he said he literally sits and does nothing. He sits, he stares at the wall, and through that process of just that inertia, basically, his brain starts like working in spite of him, if that makes sense, you know, and ideas will come. It's almost like getting into a sort of meditative state where no sort of conscious thought is coming in, but then eventually it starts to. So that's another example of how people do it.
We'll be going for another 20 minutes or so, then I'll stop and the floor will be open to questions. So as you're listening to the guys talking here, do store up anything that you want to ask. I should have said this at the beginning maybe, really, but keep storing up those ideas because we'll need some questions from you in a short time. This is another episode. This is 224, Kelly Jones, who we know for Stereophonics. And he's basically reiterating what you've just said there, that, well, we don't quite know when it's going to hit, but it will hit eventually, I think.
I've usually got like a pattern and a phrasing thing, and I try to fit it into that. And sometimes that can trap you as well, because then you're stuck with those syllables and then you're trying to fit words into that. I find sometimes a bit frustrating unless it comes naturally. Some songs write themselves, I'm sure, as you know, you spoke to many songwriters, you know, like a song like Dakota, there's no crossings out on that page, it just goes from beginning to end and there's nothing on it. And you look back at the page and you go, you know, that'd be all right if it happened every week, but they don't.
Great song, isn't it, Dakota? It's such a good song. And what he's saying there is that, if I'm reading right, is that it came to him in a flash of inspiration. It just fell from the sky almost. Is that right?
Yeah, no crossings out on the page. He just basically transcribed it as if, you know, he'd had it all along, which is amazing. And it happens to people sometimes, doesn't it? That the song seems to come through almost like some kind of telepathy or something, you know, like there is a kind of a celestial radio playing and you're just sort of taking notes, which is, you know, I think really that it's mainly because someone like Kelly Jones has created a context for creativity. He's doing that on a regular basis, and when you're doing that on a regular basis, the gears are turning, and then those things start to come to you.
Yeah, that's like Joan Armatrading, who we spoke to a few years ago as well. She talked about having kind of complete faith in herself. She's written so many songs at this point that when it's time to write a new record, well, she doesn't sweat. When she's finished the record, that's it. You know, she tours it, whatever, then takes some time off. And when it's time, she knows when the time comes to write a new one, she's got the goods. The songs will come, you know, and that does come from just sheer experience, just the process of doing it, putting the work in, working that muscle, so that when, you know, some songs are required of you, you've got them in.
So it's having that confidence in your own ability and your own temperament, I suppose, really. Yeah, exactly. Do you think there's a way that you can get into that zone? Because, you know, we heard Moby talking about writer's block earlier, but I guess if you... songwriting is so intrinsically from the heart and the head as well, isn't it? That if you get into a position where you think this just isn't working for me, stress is going to kick in. And I'm guessing, I mean, you're the expert, so I'm guessing that writing songs from a stressful place is not a good thing, or is it?
I suppose it can produce interesting things.
Yeah, I mean, plenty of people have told us they work well under pressure and they like a deadline. You know, they prefer that to just having a, you know, the completely blank page, no pressure on them whatsoever. You know, it can be really difficult in those circumstances to come up with anything. But, you know, people who've got a deadline or a brief, they have to write a song in a particular style or in the style of a particular artist. That's a good way to get the inspiration flowing.
Yeah, and I think a deadline tends to activate someone's sense of craft as well. So you might have something and you think, right, I've got to get this done by Friday. So, you know, let's make use of the techniques that I've got and the skills that I've got rather than waiting for magic to happen. It's like, okay, you know, how do you get a good pre-chorus going and how do you write a nice bridge? And they use their skills and their experience to kind of hone something. And it's like when Kelly Jones said that sometimes you can get locked into patterns. You know, he's obviously aware that there are pitfalls in the process and he's got the skills to sort of sidestep those problems. So that's more about craft, really. Was it Stuart from Bell and Sebastian said he tries to avoid pinning ideas down?
He did say that, yeah. He found he came up with more interesting melodic ideas if he wasn't sitting with a guitar or a keyboard. He could just let his mind wander and let the melody wander wherever it wanted to go. And then later he'd find the chords to put underneath.
Yeah, that's one way not to get trapped in a particular formula. And also kind of a empowering thing for songwriters as well, to know that a lot of these people that we speak to, it's not like they're masterminds and they know all the chords. And oftentimes they're saying, I just kind of followed my nose and, you know, just I've listened to a lot of music and I know what I like, and so I just tried to apply that to the situation. And they don't know what the chords are most of the time.
No.
They just, you know, they'll record things a cappella. They won't even play an instrument, some of the songwriters we speak to. So if you're out there and you don't play an instrument, you're thinking maybe you can't necessarily be a songwriter, then I would say, you know, there's lots of people out there who prove you wrong. So.
And I don't know whether you ever asked this, it almost feels like a bit of a rude question, but do you know how many of the writers that you talk to use any kind of formal music notation? Or, you know, are they able to transcribe it into written music, or are they just doing it from the head and heart, do you think, most of them?
We don't tend to ask, but I mean, I'm sure there must be quite a few in there that, like people like we spoke to the songwriters who did the songs for Frozen, and Robert Lopez. They're a married couple, and the husband, he is very trained musician. So people like that, I think, yeah, they would probably write the dots down. But you find with a lot of songwriters, they don't write down any notation. Really, probably the most they'll do is like a chord sheet. Just a basic chord sheet to show to give people, and then let whoever's playing on it just do whatever they kind of want to do within that framework.
Yeah, they tend to be much more interested in the ideas rather than the technicalities of it. So we don't really hear. Obviously, people do mention particular chords that they use or that they like, but
Or that they avoid.
Or that they avoid. Yeah, but most of the time it's about the ideas and the concepts more so than, you know, did we use a minor 9 there or whatever, you know.
I've interviewed many artists over the years, and they tell this story. Very often when I talk to them, their albums just come out.
Mm-hmm.
That's a common.
Same for us.
Yeah, I'm sure. And there's the story that I hear over and over again is that there's a deadline, and you've mentioned the importance of deadlines. And you know, as the deadline's getting nearer, the productivity goes up. But then there's almost always one track that after the deadline they stitch onto the album that dropped after that deadline. So do you think the minute that pressure's off, a new kind of creativity kicks in?
Quite possibly, yeah. Yeah, we do hear that same story, that there was always a song that comes at the 11th hour. But that could also be connected to something else that we found in the process, which is songs tend to come when people are not supposed to be writing songs anymore.
Yeah. Gaz Coombs told us that. He said whenever he's got an appointment or anything, he's literally he's on his way out the door. Suddenly, I've got an idea. I've got to sit down and it's almost like the songwriting becomes this forbidden fruit. I really should be leaving now because I'm going to be late for this thing I've got to do. But the song, and so they work on this idea, The anchoress who we spoke to last year, she said a similar thing. Like she had the train to catch, and all of a sudden, she's literally got the door open and song. So it's almost like, sort of in the back of your mind, there's these little, like, remember that cartoon strip, the numbskulls? Yeah. They're like sort of working in the background when you're not even consciously sort of thinking about that thing. They suddenly,
And what is it, do you think, they're sensing in their head when at that moment? Do you think they're actually physically hearing a tune? What is it that they're experiencing, do you think?
I think sometimes it's just a case that they're about to leave and they pick up a guitar as they're, heading to the door, strum a few chords and something happens. And we've had that same phenomenon, haven't we?
Definitely.
Where we've thought, right, it's time to finish now. And Brian starts playing a few chords and I go, oh, what's that? And then 5 minutes later, we've got something. It's like, we just spent 3 hours writing and nothing happened. And as soon as we finish, there it is,
Yeah. Who else told us that? Was it Mike Posner, was it?
Right.
One of his sort of hit songs came from a sort of co-write, because a lot of songwriters do these professional co-writing sessions where they just put almost like speed dating. They just put together with another couple of songwriters and try and come up with a song in an afternoon. And this particular session hadn't gone very well. They had really nothing they wanted to use. And just as they were about to finish, one of the writers just started idly messing about on a guitar in the corner, not even thinking about what he was doing, just started playing this riff over and over again. And then this Mike Posner said, hang on a minute, what's that? And let's get that down. And that became the seed for a song that became,
Didn't he record it on his voice notes as well? I think
they recorded on
this.
Yeah, they recorded that idea and then folded that into the finished record. Yeah. So
You mentioned co-writes there. We had a fascinating session with Egg White earlier in the week. Do you think it's a good strategy, rather than just sitting there slogging away on your own in your room trying to get to develop a song, to suddenly think, okay, let's go and sit with someone else and see if we can get some productivity together?
Yeah, I mean, it's a key way in which songwriting is done these days, for sure. Artists are often paired with professional co-writers, people whose job it is to simply co-write with artists. A lot of the people that we talk to are in bands and they co-write. And it's having another, someone else to bounce off when you've got ideas developing, isn't it?
yeah, we've heard it said that when like two writers get together and collaborate, it's like it creates a third writer in the room, because you've got your sensibility, you've got the other person's, but then those two things combined create something that neither of you would have done on your own.
That's really interesting, actually. And a lot of these are done in a day, aren't they? You talk about it being a speed dating kind of scenario. Two people are put together in a room literally for one day, and they have to, by the end of the day, have a song.
Yeah, and that's what songwriting camps are about. It's a really important organising mechanism that industry uses to get people together who are creative and say, right, we need a song for Rihanna or whoever it might be. Let's put you three together and you three together, and then in a few hours swap and change and see. They're just looking for that magic combination that creates something that could be special.
Yeah, it's also kind of mildly terrifying, the prospect of doing that, because I'm sure there's some songwriters in here, and a lot of people have told us that they feel very vulnerable when they're writing. So you've really got to sort of lay yourself bare in front of this person you might have met like half an hour before, and maybe write about something personal that's happened to you. But some writers work that to the advantage. Dan Wilson, who's a Grammy-winning writer for Adele, Taylor Swift. When he first met Adele, that's what they did. They sat and talked. They didn't write. They just got together and they talked. Oh, so what's happening with you? What's on your mind? Whatever. And that ended up with the song "Someone Like You," that just came from obviously they had the luxury there of getting to know each other a bit. They weren't just in the room for the afternoon, but but you have got to be prepared to sort of give of yourself to the other person and not kind of withhold things, and that's a very scary prospect, I think.
And that's what those people are great at, aren't they? Those professional co-writers like Dan Wilson. That's what they do. They get in a room and they just draw things out of you.
Yeah, they put people at their ease, which is a great skill as a collaborator, I think.
It's almost like a counselling session, isn't it? Where they're sitting down, tell me what's on your mind. Well, let's explore more of that, and jotting those notes down, I guess.
Yeah.
There was a story about one of my favourite songs, Candy Staton, Young Hearts Run Free, I think was written like that. I don't know what the story where. you probably interviewed whoever wrote it, I don't know, but she was going into the studio, she was going through a difficult phase in her marriage and was just confiding, and nearly the whole song is the words that she said.
Yeah.
That the writer was there thinking, oh, that'll make an interesting line, we'll park that there, and then just piece them together, said, you've just written your own song.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a classic example as well of what we were talking about earlier, you know, the upbeat, happy song with a bittersweet lyric. I mean, that might be the ultimate example, to be honest. And I'm always amused when I hear that at weddings, because it's a song about, oh, don't get tied down, you know.
Yeah.
It's just the height of irony.
Yeah, yeah.
It is true. What tools do you think a songwriter should have? If you've mentioned that we're all a bit different, but what are the key things? Whether you were talking about a bit of software, or I don't know, just some stationery for that matter, anything that a songwriter needs to have to hand.
Well, I think one of the brilliant things about songwriting is that it probably has the lowest barrier to accessing it of any artistic practice. I mean, you can literally grab a pencil and a piece of paper and write a song. You know, you don't really need to invest in anything. What we've found is that voice notes, certainly any kind of voice notes app, has become like absolute core tool for songwriters. So if you are a songwriter and you're not making use of capturing ideas on a regular basis using voice notes, I would encourage you to do so. I mean, obviously you can end up with hundreds of bits and pieces of things that it becomes really hard to navigate through. Labeling them might be a good idea.
Yeah.
But yeah, voice notes, and then beyond that, obviously, to have a success with the song, you're going to need to have some element of production as well. So you're going to need to invest in a DAW, or use Logic or something like that.
Got another clip now. This is Julian Lennon from episode 236, and I listened to this, and well, I went to bed on this last night. Was thinking about it overnight. It's a really interesting thing that he says here. And I'd just like your take on this.
So if I've written a song, basically, recording, produce it, there you go. I'm on to the next thing. I'm not thinking about that anymore. I'm over there. You know, I have had awful occasions where I've, ended up at people's houses and they've had a piano or a guitar and they say, play something. And I'll literally go, I can't. No, come on, don't be a diva, play something. I can't.
So why can't he?
I guess because for some songwriters, that the process of creating a song and recording it is just a transient thing. When once it's out there, as he said, they're done. They move on to the next thing. They're always thinking about the new. An artist is always most excited about the last thing he's done or the newest thing he's working on. So, and it's just a fact that some people don't have that, whatever it is, to be able to just pick up a guitar and play any song. I mean, I know people like that, and I hate them for it because they just seem to have this endless, bottomless reservoir of songs they can play, and can entertain a room full of people at the drop of a hat, or you can remember their own songs perfectly if someone requests something. And I identify with Julian. My song, there's a few that sort of stick in my mind that I can easily access, but most things I have to sit down and go, how did that go again? What are those chords? So yeah, but as I say, it's a kind of a fleeting thing for a lot of people. They get the idea down, they've got it out the system, and then they're on to the next thing.
It also depends on the nature of your career as well, I think. So someone like Paul McCartney has been asked to play those same songs for 50 years or something, whereas the average professional co-writer might go into a session, write something, and then move on. There is maybe a demo made of something, and then it goes to the label, and then they've got 5 other sessions that week, and they never really revisit that song. So if you ask them to perform it, they'd probably, like Brian said, they'd have to go back and say, well, how did that one go? So, yeah.
Another clip here. This is from Brett Anderson from Suede, and he's talking about the importance of the top line cutting through, which I thought was a really interesting, something I've not thought about before.
Yeah, absolutely. I had the kind of world's crappiest record player. It's one of those ones where you had to sort of keep fiddling with the volume thing to kind of get the sound coming out of both speakers. And then when you did, literally there's no bottom end. It was there's no bass. And so, yeah, it just made me focus on the top line. And I've always sort of heard songs through the top line, and bass was sort of something I didn't even really hear for many years. I kind of hear it now, though, and I love it now, but it's taken me a while.
to him tomorrow, actually. So what's the point he's making there, then? If you were going to rephrase it, what's the point that Brett is making there?
I think it's that a lot of his songwriting skill emerged from that experience, that he was always really drawn to melody, essentially. And you can see that play out in his songwriting, because a lot of that Suede stuff is really strongly memorable.
Yeah, a lot of soaring melodies in Suede songs. And so, yeah, it makes a lot of sense that he would have been so sort of laser focused on melody from a young age.
And there are people we've interviewed who have that skill. Some people these days, you know, that is their specialist skill. They are top liners. And they go into studios and there'll be a track that's been produced by a team, say Stargate or someone like that. And then, you know, you'll get a professional, someone like Esther Dean, for example, will go in and we'll be given a chorus and we'll lay down 5 or 6 possible melodies for that chorus. And then they will say, oh, we love that third one or whatever, and then maybe that will make the song. So again, that's going back to that method that I mentioned when we talked about Xenomania, that sort of very industrialized approach to just getting specialists in, freelancers to come in and deliver one particular piece of the song. And it's quite a difficult economic model, I suppose, because if you're the person who comes in and you give 5 ideas and there's 5 other people with 5 ideas, you know, how likely is it that your chorus is the one that's going to be chosen? So, yeah, quite a difficult world to be in, I think. But loads of people out there who just have a gift for melody, and that's what they do all day, is drop great melodies on top of chord sequences.
So if someone's summoned for a session like that, then do they even have the lyrics, or do they just walk in with a blank canvas? They're listening to a backing track, and then they're just there and then going to come up with a song over the top
I
of
think
it?
oftentimes
I think
they
it's a
just
backing track,
walk in with a coffee, and just nail it, just deliver 5 possible melodies or something like that. That's the gift. That's
It's
why
amazing,
they get
isn't
the money.
it, actually? Yeah. That
And
is-
Esther Dean, who I mentioned, is one of those people. You know, if you look her up, you'll see, you know, she's been dropping choruses on big hits for years.
This is Matty from the in fact, it might be the whole 1975, I'm not sure. The importance of the story, because that's something we've not really touched upon, isn't it? We've touched upon the mood and the environment, but you know, most songs have a story behind them. So let's hear what Matty's got to say about it.
From the beginning of pop culture, we've gone, right, what about swing music? What about punk music? What about jazz music? What about reggae music, rave music? We've gone through all these different genres. The whole 20th century. Been doing it for like nearly 100 years. And we've come down to Adele, which is a piano, a story, and a believable voice. So it's story, basically, with as little stuff that gets in the way of the emotion.
Wanna see how much drink I can take, then be my mistake.
So this is going from the top line to actually making it believable, isn't it? This is going just from a pure melody to getting you to emotionally invest in the song, yeah?
That's it, yeah. I think someone like Matty's a good example, because he writes very much in that way. He's very connected to his thought processes, isn't he, and to his emotions. And I mean, ultimately, songwriting's about communication, isn't it? So if you can strip back all the complications of production and whatever might come in the future, and just have a core of an idea that says something that might be important to people in some way, then you're half the way there, aren't you, really?
You are, but then the flip of that is that there are plenty of songs that where the lyrics are utterly meaningless, yet somehow end up meaning things to people, and people love them. You know, if you think of, there's any number, but you know, if you think I Am the Walrus is by design nonsense.
Yellow is a good one, isn't it, as well?
Yellow, yeah. But if you marry the poetry of those words with the right music, it can create a meaning for people and create an image in people's minds that means something to them or has a significance for them. So there's so many ways to go about a lyric, really.
Yeah, I think maybe the defining factor is saying something that we've heard before in a new way.
Yeah.
Just finding the way to say something that strikes people. So they go, oh, wow, I've never thought of that before. Like our next episode is with Tim Burgess from the Charlatans. And he's got a song in his repertoire called The Centre of Me is a Symphony of You. I mean, if you can come up with something like that, then everyone's heard I love you a million times, haven't they? But that's just a new way to say it. That just is so crystalline, you can put that into a song right away. And that's what he did. He got that title and he wrote the song.
Yeah, or there are people who are extremely direct about it. Like, I mean, Ed Sheeran would probably be the best example of that. Perhaps his greatest skill or asset is the fact that he'll just say it straight. He won't try and dress it up in whether you like him or not. He won't try and dress it up in kind of flowery poetry or anything like that, or it's a metaphor, and he'll just state, like, you know, I love you. And sometimes that's, you know, I think Matty from the 1975, there's a song on their latest album called I'm in Love With You, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he was trying to think of a clever way. Can't call, you know, I'm trying to find a clever way of saying this. And the band just went, just say I'm in love with you. Sometimes the simplest, most direct thing is what you need. In the same way as that if you you know, musically, so, you know, you can try for something complicated, you can try for this crazy operatic melody, these like fiendish chord changes, or you can just play C and A minor, you know. And that if that's what works, then that's fine. And I think someone like Ed Sheeran is like, if that works, if that's getting across what I needed to say, then I'm not going to try and make it any more complicated than that. And it's worked for him.
Yeah. So essentially what we're saying is there are no rules. All of those things will work fine.
Disregard everything we've said.
Final thing from me before we open the floor is there seem to be an ever-increasing number of court cases where it feels like someone is alleging that someone else has nicked a part of their song. Is this real, do you think, or is it just that a melody gets into the subconscious and gets churned out without the person realising they're doing it?
I think that the latter thing is definitely, I mean, that's happened to me. I've written things, and you're sure you've written things as well, and then, you know, a couple of weeks down the line, that's that song by whoever, right. You know, and you have to ditch it. So I think it does, the subconscious thing certainly happens. I think some people do try and get away with murder.
Yeah,
you know?
The old adage, where there's a hit, there's a writ.
Yeah. I mean, the famous one in recent years is the Blurred Lines cases, which I actually thought was ridiculous. I thought they didn't rip off. All they did was take the feel of Got to Give It Up by Marvin Gaye. They took the sort of, you know, electric piano on the upbeats and the sort of groove of it. But you can't copyright a groove. They took the vibe of the track and created something else over the top. You know, if you superimpose the tune of Blurred Lines over Got to Give It Up, it would be a mess. They're not the same thing, but somehow a court saw fit to say, oh no, they are the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is interesting, very interesting. Right, it's your turn now. So do we have a roaming mic in here anywhere, please? We do? So do please put your hand up if you've got a question to ask, whether you're a songwriter yourself or whether you'd like some inspiration. We'd like to know about any of the artists that we've been speaking about here. Who's going to start the ball rolling? Oh, there we go. Sorry.
Do the pair of you two still write songs? And also, what's behind the name of Sodajerker?
We do write songs, yeah. Not necessarily successfully, but yeah, we do get together and try and apply all this wisdom that we've gathered from all these people in our own writing. Got quite a lot of stuff recently, haven't we? The name Sodajerker is, well, Brian spotted it in an interview, didn't you?
I think I'd heard it before that, but I just saw the word in print. It was an interview with a film director, and he was a Jewish film director and sort of quite geeky looking in his youth. So he was an actor when he was young, and he said he was always cast as the Sodajerker in TV and films or wherever. So we just like looked up that word, didn't we? And it was the in sort of 50s America, like the diners and the soda fountains and things. They were the guys with the little jaunty hats who operated the soda fountain, and we sort of looked into that further, didn't we? Like the etymology of it. And
yeah, and then I found an academic article called "The Linguistic Concoctions of the Sodajerker," and it was about how people in that environment used to sort of retitle all the dishes and have this really creative approach. So instead of like a ham sandwich to go, they would say, dress one pig and take it for a walk. You know, these sorts of things.
A scrambled egg on toast would be Adam and Eve on a raft and Wreckham. And we were sort of stunned by it because we thought, wow, those guys were like being super creative with, and you know, going back to what Si was saying about finding new ways to say everyday things. We thought that just allies perfectly with the songwriting theme of the podcast, you know.
Yeah, and the domain name was free as well.
Yeah,
that's important. Good question. There we go.
So what actually made you want to start a podcast in the first place?
It was probably quite selfish reasons, wasn't it? I think at the time we were writing songs together and we thought maybe we could get more attention if people got to know us, and if they got to like us, maybe they'd like the songs we were writing as well. So we just thought, well, we'll talk about songwriting on a podcast, and then we realised no one's going to care what we say about songwriting, so we thought, well, we'll try and interview some songwriters, and that's when we sent out the first emails, and we thought, well, we may as well aim high, and so we just emailed these famous songwriters, and luckily they said yes. So that's why it started, and then as it snowballed, we thought, oh, maybe if we get to 10, that'd be great. And then it was like, if we hit 50, that'd be amazing. And now it's like 245 episodes. So, yeah, we just can't say no, because every year something great happens. You know, we get offered to go and sit in some person's kitchen and listen to them play guitar, and it's like, wow, it's Sting or something. It's great.
It's a good question. At what point did you realise that actually people were now coming to you rather than you going to them?
It was probably a couple of years in, maybe. Yeah. Maybe 2 years in, yeah. Because as we said, you know, we just first sent out a ton of emails just and to see what came back, and then as we were saying, you know, we sort of gradually built momentum, built up a bit of a reputation, got some good people on who then, you know, if we requested someone else, they would say, oh, they've had Jimmy Webb or they've had whoever. All right, I'll do that. And then we just kept at it, and then eventually the offers from publicists started creeping in, and then it got to the point where almost exclusively that's how we book guests. We didn't have to send requests out. Now and again we'll do it these days, very very seldom, but mostly it's offers.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
it's fantastic. Right, just 2 rows back there, please. Thank you.
I wanted to ask how you would go about writing in a genre that you struggle to write in. Like, you might say don't, but if you had to, how would you go about that?
It's a good question. I don't suppose we've talked to many songwriters who've been in a position where they had to write in a genre that they don't really work in, because I think in most professional situations, they pick the person that they know can do that job really well. So they'll get the ballad guy, or they'll get the woman who does, you know, great kind of rock tracks or whatever, specifically for that artist. But I suppose the best way to go about it would just be to embed yourself in that music and to just listen as much as possible. And one of the ways that we succeed in doing our interviews is through the research process. Like, we do quite a vast process of research where we'll listen to things that the people have said before, we'll look at interviews with them, we'll listen to playlists of their work, we'll know all the songs when we turn up, so that if they go off on a particular tangent, we can talk with some knowledge about that thing. And that usually is the key to unlocking all the stories, because most of these people, believe it or not, don't really get asked about creativity or songs very often. You know, when you sit down with Noel Gallagher, most of the time it's, you know, how's your brother doing, or what was it like on tour, was it crazy, and all of this sort of stuff. And very seldom do people sit down and say, how did you come up with that chord sequence for the chorus? And so people are usually like baffled by this when we ask them these kinds of questions. And so I think if you really know what you're talking about, that's the best way to proceed. So I would just say listen to as much of that kind of music as you possibly could.
Yeah, because certain genres they have a very specific language, like country and western has a very specific kind of language chord-wise, and you know, has a very narrative, lyrical style. Or I don't know, the gospel music, as of, you know, the chord voicings and things like that are very specific, and there's a lot of movements, and so, you know, yeah, it would just be a case of just steeping yourself in as much of that stuff as possible, and hoping you can sort of replicate it to some degree.
Good question again. Thank you. Right. There are a few down the front. We'll go just there and then travel down to the front, please.
Thanks for taking my question, firstly. But I wanted to ask, with all the artists and songwriters you've talked to, do you tend to find that artists will write songs for themselves or for the listeners?
Yeah,
Really good question.
Yeah, great question. I suppose it really depends on who the artist is. If you're talking about someone who has an eye on the business side of what they do, and they're very sort of connected with their A&R representatives, and they're very, in contact with the label and all of that, then they might well have more of an eye on what the market needs and what they need to produce to satisfy their audience and keep their career going and that sort of thing. And that's no bad thing. There's plenty of people out there who do that, and they might be more mainstream pop artists who've, hit upon something that is popular and they want to maintain that. And so they'll bring in, pro writers to work with them and collaborate and keep this thing going. Someone who's a bit more experienced and maybe steeped in a long career, like a Paul Simon or someone like that, is probably just trying to amuse himself, I would imagine, and is pushing the boundaries of what he feels he can do with a song. Yeah. That's my general sort of take on it.
No, yeah, same. But there are also writers who will maybe, they'll think, we need like an up-tempo rocker to play at gigs to get people jumping, so they'll write a song with that sort of brief in mind. But those same artists will write very personal songs as well. It's just, but they're aware that, if I'm playing a show, we need something to get people jumping a little bit. So, and then there's other writers who, I guess Mike Viola would be a good example, wouldn't he, of there's this great American songwriter called Mike Viola, who we're huge fans of, and we've sort of become friendly with over the course of him being on the podcast a couple of times. But we watched him play the other night, and he said during the gig, like, every one of my songs is about someone in my life. That's just the way it goes, and he just wouldn't. I think he's written songs for films and things where people have actually given him a brief, but his own solo material is extremely personal. To the point, it's really soul bearing stuff, and that's, for him, that's the only way he can write it material. So,
good question. So, and we had a couple of people down the front here, please, if that's okay. I haven't really been looking over there. I'll look over there in a minute.
Hello. I just wondered, out of kind of everyone you've talked to, are there any tips and techniques from certain songwriters like Paul McCartney or Julian Lennon that you've kind of taken and you use to this day to write songs?
There must be.
I think what we tend to do is we use that stuff when we get stuck more than anything, because we have quite a strong sense of what we want to do when we sit down to write, and we want to just be led by our own inspirations and stuff like that. So we don't try and sort of consciously apply a lot of that stuff until we kind of get stuck, and then we think, maybe it's a case of repeating that chorus there and dropping that part, which is what we learned from, this particular person.
I mean, a lot of things we've just found out, we have that sort of in common with that person, because we've been writing songs together since we were 15, 16. So, when Gaz Coombs says, when I'm about to leave the house, that's suddenly when an idea arrives. We'll go, oh, right, yeah, that happens with us as well. I think that a good one that we heard quite early on in the run of the podcast was from Mike Batt, who's most famous possibly for writing the Wombles theme tune. But he said, when his daughter was little and she'd be drawing, and she'd say, can't think of anything to draw. He'd say, well, just make a mark on the paper, and then, something will come from that. Might be something particularly good, but it's, just start anything. You can always throw out that first bit afterwards, but usually you find if you just start with something, it'll lead somewhere. If you just sort of pull on the thread. So that's something I've tried to employ. Just get something going, get something started. Also, I mentioned Matt Berninger before from the National, and how he writes over pre-written backing tracks by his band and stuff. I've started doing that a little bit as well. just sort of mocking up almost an entire song structure on. It's not quite as random as the way Matt does it. Like I'll map out like a verse, a chorus, what could possibly be a bridge, and then just start trying coming up with a song over the top of that.
And then he sends them to me, and I'll usually sit down really late at night when I'm sort of semi-tired and try and come up with stuff over the top. And that's another thing that we sort of learned through the podcast, is that very early morning when you're just waking up, or late at night when you're just going to sleep, your brain sometimes gets into another zone where it's a little bit more kind of permissive and will just throw things at you, and you know, you can come up with some really unusual, weird stuff there if you sort of write when you're in that
sort
place.
of hinterland between wake and sleep.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good one. And I think... Thank you.
Obviously, you guys have been songwriters for years as well. Have you had an artist who, because obviously you would have like preconceived, like, this is how I songwrite. Was there an artist that you like sat down with and were like, wow, that's really changed my perspective of songwriting? Was there ever like a person you sat down with who was like, wow, okay, this is different now?
So you basically reformed your opinion of someone based on talking to them. That's what you're saying, yeah?
Kind of like, so you'll have your ideas of how you songwrite.
Of how we write.
Yeah.
By that bit.
And then if you've sat down after the blue rinse kind of like ended, if you sat down with someone, if you sat down with someone and been like, oh, I had my own ideas of how I write songs, and now I've talked to that person, that's completely different.
Yeah, I don't know if there's been one sort of person that's sort of transformed our approach, but we probably have incrementally transformed based on little bits and pieces from all those people through the years. You know, like we've talked to people who worked in the Brill building in the 60s and stuff like that, haven't we? And you know, they would adopt like entire strategies for co-writing. Like they would write on particular days with particular people, and then they'd have different partners, and they would swap over and write with different people, and then maybe they would write at home or they would write at the office, and they would do all this stuff, and they were always just in service of trying to come up with something great. And so when you see that kind of discipline, you sort of think, oh, well, maybe we should apply some of that discipline. So come to mine for 3 days and we'll work, in 9 till 12 and then 1 till 5, and we probably apply things that we've learned through the process just by seeing the kind of discipline that these people have when they work.
Yeah, I'd say the same. I can't think of anyone like specifically, but there's definitely been a cumulative effect over it's nearly 12 years now we've been doing it. So you just can't help but, it really has changed. I think it's made us a lot, maybe slightly more self-critical about ideas, maybe ideas that we would have felt fine with before starting the podcast. Now we just probably throw out, and that's not good enough. It's made us a little bit more, what's the word, perfectionistic?
Perhaps, yeah, because you just see these amazing people all the time who are so good, and it seems almost effortless to them. And so it's hard to think like, oh yeah, well, my idea is in any way comparable to that,
Like I think we've become a lot pickier over lyrics now. I think that's a result of doing the podcast. Like we just won't let a bad line get by, or what we think is a bad line, or a weird word that doesn't sing well. We'll throw that out and try and find a better one. Things like that. Yeah, it's just this sort of cumulative effect of all the interviews we've done and all the knowledge we've gleaned from all these people. I think it can't help but have an effect on how you do things.
Brilliant question, thank you. Right, I'm just going to look over here briefly, and I'll be back with you. I've seen you over there, because I'm aware I've been looking at this side of the room and not that side. So just over there, please. Oh, yeah, just there. Thank you. And Holly, I've seen you as well, and then we'll come over to you over there.
Hiya. First of all, thank you for the great advice. And I was just wondering, what are some of the most interesting songwriting techniques that you've come across?
Any unusual ones?
Yeah, there's some that surprised us. Like Ben Watts, who was in Everything But the Girl, he was writing books and things at the time, wasn't he, when we spoke to him? And he was starting to use like entire things from his books, like actual prose from a novel, essentially, as like the basis of songs, and that was sort of unusual. Most people don't work that way. People who write without any kind of instrumental accompaniment is always really interesting. because it gives them, as we said, a kind of a shape to the song that might be unusual. Like the meter of the song might end and start in unusual places because it wasn't underpinned by a conventional kind of 4/4 chord sequence or something like that.
I think what we said earlier about the writing just using like vowel sounds and things, you know, and gibberish, just singing gibberish, you know, rather than sort of editing yourself for the second you start, like and smothering the song at birth, if you like. You know, just let it, wherever comes out, come out, and then shape the lyric around the gibberish. I think that's a good one. I mean, we've had people say, was it Gary Newman who said he won't use certain vowel sounds, or he won't use certain. I mean, we were just talking about being picky about lyrics and how certain words and things, and Gary Newman told us there's just certain words he won't use because they don't sound good coming out. He knows his own voice so well and what works when he sings, that there's certain words he won't use, certain vowel sounds he won't use. He won't end a line with a particular. What did he say?
I think he wouldn't end it on an A or something. It had to be an E because he can sing that strongly. Whereas you say A, it doesn't really work. Whereas E has a much more power behind it. You know, things like that.
And as we were saying, that's crept into how we write lyrics now. We've become almost super conscious of that's a weird word to sing. Why do we put that one in? It's got to be one that has more of a flow to it.
Cheers. Thank you.
Very good. And there was Holly at the back there, please.
Hello. So the way that we consume music commercially is ever changing, and you guys, I guess, would have seen the songwriting process throughout this kind of massive change with like TikTok and viral sounds and stuff. Have you noticed a shift in how people are writing songs to kind of cater for the way that we consume music, particularly with like the uptake of TikTok and viralness?
Yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily talk to people who explicitly say that, but there is a general trend towards shorter intros that contain maybe one or two hooks, so that the listener is you know, actually on board in the first 10 seconds and that sort of thing. And oftentimes those decisions are made in order to bypass Spotify skip rates, because they want to get the person beyond the first 30 seconds of the song so that the author might have a chance of actually getting paid. So yeah, I think certainly in like intense pop songwriting circles, you know, there is definitely those kind of conversations go on. How do we get the listener on board with, you know, some kind of, what do they call it, like a millennial whoop or something like that, in the, you know, a sort of a O kind of sound that happens from the beginning of the song, so they're going to be like, oh yeah, we know this one, keep this on, you know. So yeah, the general trend towards that, though, the people we speak to, they don't tend to be thinking in that way. A lot of the people we speak to are artists who are writing to try and kind of explore their, you know, inner feelings and this sort of thing, and they're not necessarily worried too much about kind of commercial pop success in that sense.
Thank you. Good one, Holly. And there was someone over here. There we go. Please, thank you.
Hi, I was just wondering, like, if you two are writing a song and you've both got two parts that differ, how would you kind of decide which one to go with, and how do you resolve differences when songwriting?
Just go with mine, wouldn't we?
I was going to say a fist fight. It's an interesting one, yeah.
I think we're both pretty.
I think years ago we might have been a little bit more. What's the word?
Resilient?
Yeah, not resilient. No, stubborn. That's the word I was looking for.
Trying to be nice.
Whereas now, you know, we're just older and we're old and tired. We can't be bothered fighting. So generally, whoever comes up with the best thing, we just go with. We'll, you know, but we're aware that we're both working towards the same goal, just making the song as good as it can be. So neither of us is too precious about an idea.
And I suppose our process has changed a bit over the years as well. So previously, like, I was writing a lot of stuff, wasn't I? Usually on the guitar and coming up with words, all of the words. And these days, usually it's Brian at the piano and me sort of stalking around the room. So we write now
hovering over my shoulder.
Yeah, these days we write more like some kind of like Tin Pan Alley team.
But separately a lot as well.
Yeah.
So often, one of us might come with almost a fully formed song, really, and the other will just help tweak it.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
I think we're getting towards the end, aren't we, John? So 2 minutes. Wow. So we've got time for one more very quick one, if you like. If you've been sitting there holding your question or just feeling a bit shy, now's the time to do it. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you right at the back there.
So when you're writing songs together, how do you like properly credit each other? In terms of like, if you know one of you've done more work than the other person.
It's a good question.
Again, we're not very precious about that, really. You know, normally, one person originates the idea. That's just the way it goes every time. But and yet, so we've done some pretty 50-50.
Yeah, we just call everything 50-50, don't we?
It's just easier that way.
So I can just get rich off the back of
It's
the talent.
yeah, it's not like the royalties are flowing in anyway, so it's not too much of a concern. But
when the money comes, that'll be when the problem.
Yeah. But no, it's again, we're just working towards the same goal, really. You know, whoever comes in with the idea, the others help and get it finished, and it kind of, you find if you just like the end product, it doesn't matter, and sometimes you forget who did what on a song. And if the end product is what you were aiming for, and you like what you end up with, it doesn't really matter who did more, to us anyway.
Yeah. Plus, my lawyer's been robbing him for years.
So who else have you got coming up? You mentioned Tim Burgess. Have you recorded that one yet? Is that done?
That's recorded, yeah.
Okay.
So
anyone on your bucket list of someone you still want to talk to?
There's loads. Yeah.
I've almost become reluctant to, because we've been asked that before,
right.
And I feel like we jinx it whenever we mention anybody, and I feel like, well, these are the people we haven't had on, I mean, there's obvious ones. There's Carole King, Randy Newman for me personally, Dolly Parton, Barry Gibb. There's plenty, but
there's loads.
But there's we also find that. There's people we've interviewed in the last couple of years that when we started the podcast were like 11 and we're just starting to write songs, and in that time have become successful artists and songwriters. We haven't, but they have, and that's something we could never have envisaged when we started. We just thought, right, let's get a bunch of songwriters on we like, and it never occurred to us that 10 years down the line, people who were kids when we started, literally, we'd be talking to them about their process. So it sort of yields all those kind of nice surprises too. I
think Declan McKenna was doing his GCSEs, wasn't he?
Yeah, Maisie Peters was another one, yeah.
Declan McKenna is still in his teens, isn't he? Just never.
He looks like he is.
He is.
Yeah.
Brian and Simon, thank you so much. It's been absolutely amazing. Please give it up for Brian and Simon from the Sodajerker podcast. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's amazing.
Thanks for the questions.
Cheers.
You for your amazing questions as well. I'll see you again very soon. Thank you.